Hi, and welcome to Chronic Health. My name is Sebastian. On this podcast, I talk to the leading experts on the science and practical nuance of lifestyle medicine and personalized medicine, with the goal of helping practitioners get smarter about their treatments and any listener get smarter about their own health. Dan, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Very good, thanks. Thanks so much, Sebastian, for inviting me on your podcast. I enjoy the subject, and I think we can chat a bit and be helpful for people to understand this space a little
I
better.
think so too. Yeah.
So thanks again.
It's as always. I'm very thankful for all the experts like you who come on here. It's so I love this so much, to be honest. It's so interesting to talk to all these people who have all these years of experience in different fields that are important for health. So. I'll start with a confession. And I think some people who have listened to previous podcasts know this already, but for various logistical reasons, I recorded the first few episodes of this podcast with these like AirPods, in my ears. I will say I'm still not, compared to the other subjects that I'm more, not an expert maybe, but I'm much more experienced within. I'm still very much, I don't know much about EMFs. And I've intentionally kept it that way because I want to learn from you, essentially. But yeah, so I'm not super knowledgeable, but I was aware that was not great. I tried to order new headphones and they didn't come and all this stuff. So anyway. But yeah, I have kept it so that I know basically as much as most people who will listen to this, I think. Maybe a little bit more. I don't know, but we'll see.
Okay.
But let's start with you. So tell us about a little bit more about your background, and I'm also curious, like more specifically about if there was any specific situation where when you first started suspecting that there might be harmful effects with EMFs, or when you just started thinking about EMFs in this way?
Sebastian, there was a telecommunications network in the U.S., the Bell system. And the Bell system had manufacturing facilities, they had development facilities, they had service providers. It was a complete organization, essentially providing soup to nuts for the service, the telephone service that was being provided in the U.S. I was actually in the research development side of the companies, and my job was to develop standards for telecommunications networks. And then I would test the technologies to see if they were compliant to what they had to be standardized for the networks. So I was very heavily involved for many, many, many years in the technology space. Then I sort of retired from that space probably 20 years ago. And my sons, who were adult males, were visiting me. And my wife said, when they had their laptops on their lap for hours, she said, "That can't be good for you." And I laughed. I said, "There's not enough power coming from a laptop, from the RF signal that was being generated for the Wi-Fi connection, and the operating functions of the electronics, which also emits emissions, was very, very low emissions." I used to look for emissions in the network, and I used to somehow identify and resolve problems where there's crosstalk and stuff like that with networks. So I was pretty familiar with the subject matter. But then I hesitated a tiny bit, and I said, well, I don't know, let's see if there's a potential. Maybe I wasn't aware of what it really was. And so I looked, and even back then, roughly 12 years ago, I found that after about 4 years of exposure from a laptop on a lap, there was something like 25% impact to the male sperm.
Right.
I had been doing this for years and years and years, and I didn't know that. So I began looking into the research side of the technologies to see if I could find more evidence. And it was odd. I really did find an awful lot of scientific evidence that suggested that electromagnetic radiation that's around us can potentially be dangerous and be harmful to our bodies. So I was a mechanical engineer in trade, although all my business was electronics. I built my boys a laptop plate, essentially Defender pad, I called it. And I said, you can use this and the signals can't get past your body. And that's how I started. It literally was uh, uh, based on my experiences. I had pretty serious knowledge in this space. And then when I was exposed to something outside of business that was really important, that no one knew, I said, maybe I can play and help people understand what this stuff's all about. And that's what started it.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It sounds like the typical entrepreneur story, I would say, where you have your own personal problem and you're sort of creating a solution for it. So I want to.
Sebastian, one of the things I found was there was not really well understood electrical understanding of what this stuff was all about. So one of the very things I started doing is trying to standardize on terms, so everyone could talk about it and understand it in a way that everyone can understand it. And so, there was a role that I could apply, which I did in the past, to help everyone understand it. And by the way, that led to a book my son and I wrote, which is Radiation Nation, which is it's a book we wrote because we wanted people to try to understand what we are in our environment, if it was dangerous or not, what science says, and what kinds of things we can do about it in our own life.
Perfect. That's I the way we've structured this discussion is going to be basically a mini version of the book, I think. So if anyone's interested, I think then the book is probably the next step to go to. But it's a good segue because I want to get back to the like going deeper on the science later. But first of all, what you just said, the standardized terms and everything, so that people can start discussing this. Let's start there. What is EMF radiation, and where does it come from, except from laptops that we already mentioned?
EMF is electromagnetic frequencies. They are transmissions that are in our environment that have many sources, which I'll go through. And the electrical wiring in our household, or the motors that we run in our refrigerators, all generate emissions. And there's two types: electromagnetic radiation, ELF, extremely low frequency, and that's the refrigerator stuff, your hair blower stuff. They all emit emissions. And then you have your cell phones, your laptops, your Wi-Fi, all of them transmitting a signal into the air that goes from one place to the next, like a cell phone in 1.6 watts per kilogram, which is a power level of a cell phone, goes almost 5 miles. And so a Wi-Fi, maybe 500 feet, maybe up to 2,000, depending on the equipment. So these devices, 10 years ago, were all around us. But today they're all right in our pockets. And so all of a sudden, these emissions that have been around for years and years and years, all of a sudden are very close to the human body. And the body's trying to figure out what to do with it.
Right. Are there any natural sources of these radiations?
Yeah, actually, the Earth itself generates a DC
Okay.
emission, and it's less than 15 hertz is what it is, and it's a DC signal, a direct current signal that is emitted from the body. Light, believe it or not, when light itself is electromagnetic radiation, believe it or not. And you may, Sebastian, have heard of blue light. In the course of modern science today, there is a better understanding of the potential dangers of blue light that happens to be coming from all these devices we have. Your screen from your laptop or your cell phone, they're generating an LED signal that has a blue component to it that's slightly more dangerous than the blue light that comes from the sun.
Okay. In what way? Like, why is that?
So this is a tough question to answer, but a good one, because all these kids and adults, they're going to bed at night and they're looking at their laptop screen, and all this blue light's going in. Well, it turns out that it interferes with the creation of melatonin, because there's a little cryptochrome switch, a cryptochrome protein switch in the back of the eye that turns on and off when it's light outside or dark outside. That's how we learn the 24-hour cycle of sleep, is from that kind of body function that occurs. And when you look at a laptop at night, that switch is not turned on for the melatonin. So it's literally true that you can't go to sleep necessarily because it's interfered with the biological function of. And it's also true that when you look at these monitors, you don't blink as much, so you get dry eye. Dry eye is where your eye is dry, and then in some cases it's actually premature macular degeneration. It goes back to the retina of the eye, and actually can deteriorate that retina if it's very high concentrated use of these devices. So there is human impact just from blue light, but that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, do you know why we don't blink as much, like compared to, I guess, when we?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't really know, but believe it or not, like something like 15% of us have dry eye as a result of using electronic devices, and it is a problem, right? I was working with a clinic, and I was chatting with them, and they were telling me about one of the people working in the office had dry eyes and put little drops in their eyes every day for 5 years. And so I said, well, what's the source of it? Oh, we don't really know. So I sent them glasses that blocked the blue component. Within 2 hours, her eyes cleared up. For 5 years, she had this problem because she'd been looking at a monitor all these years.
Yeah, I certainly recognize myself in that when I have my work is mostly in front of the computer, which is I like most of it, but that is something that I am in the long term trying to work on. That hopefully I'll be able to do more of my work not in front of my computer.
Yeah, it's balance, Sebastian.
And then,
it's
of course, I
balance,
do
right?
use the blue blocking glasses and all this stuff. So,
Right, which is amazing help
absolutely.
when you do.
So that's EMF radiation, and then we have more recently, which is I guess some controversy around or some strong opinions around is 5G, the 5G networks, and so how does that relate to EMF radiation?
Okay, so here's some slightly technical terms. When your cell phone operates at roughly 1 gigahertz, your Wi-Fi acts at 2.4, 5.6, 6.0.
These are frequencies, right?
So everything, these are frequencies. A hertz is one cycle in 1 second passing a point. one cycle in 1 second. So if you have 1 gigahertz, that's 1 billion cycles per second. Billion waves, billion of them going past this point in 1 second. So it's really fast, right? And then when you talk about the 5G, the fifth generation, which is the evolution of the telecommunications networks, a lot of what the 5G does is within the similar space as most of our Wi-Fi's and devices around us. The controversy tends to lie in what's beyond that in 5G. And that is where there is, in the US, for example, 5G has been authorized to be used in the US up to 300 gigahertz. So all of a sudden, above 10 gigahertz, nobody's seen this in the networks at all. And there's this controversy is all swirling around what these new RF signals, these new electromagnetic radiation signals in their environment. Do we really know what's the impact of the human body? Sebastian, if you said, I do understand a little bit about that, I would say you don't know, you don't understand anything because no science has been done. And that's really the issue. We just don't know.
Yeah.
We do know that 80 gigahertz, for example, will interfere with the sweat gland, and it actually will heat your sweat gland up. So we do know some science about the higher rates. We know that 20 gigahertz, the bugs in your stomach, the bacteria and virus, love 20 gigahertz. It loves 1 gigahertz as well. So what we know is we know it's disrupting certain body function, but at 20 gigahertz, which is much, much faster, we don't know what the real implication is. And really, that's where the controversy lies. We really don't know. And it's going to take us a while to understand it.
And isn't that classic technological progression? We are very good at making tools, and then we find out like 20 years later how bad they were also on top of the...
Yeah, right. Sebastian, when I was young, at 12 years old, I snuck into my father's room and I took a cigarette and I smoked it because the ads, made me, people who smoke were a real man if you smoke cigarettes. At that time, which is over 50 years ago, science knew that there was a correlation between smoking and cancer in the lungs. But we didn't know it. And that was the typical model for introducing certain technologies without fully understanding the implications.
So then it sounds very wise to question, or to really put up a warning sign and say that we don't know enough. I really think we should think more like this with technology. So, but I mean, to me, it sounds like it's potentially not great if we know already with the lower frequencies that they can affect parts of the body and stuff like this. But then there's also this other component, which is like the distance. You mentioned it before, where you have your phone close to you or like in your pocket all the time. How important is that aspect of it? Like how far you are from these signals and everything?
It's very, very important. If you want to take a precautionary approach to an environmental lifestyle, it's good to know sort of what a little bit of the rules are about those kinds of electromagnetic radiation in our environment. One of the best things to think about when you think about these technologies is what we've said before. 15, 20 years ago, these emissions were around but not close to our bodies. Well, today, when you are in a room and you have your family who have cell phones, who have laptops, who have Wi-Fi, all of a sudden you have dozens and dozens of transmitters in a room that you didn't have before. So, I like to argue, one bee won't kill you, 1,000 will. And so, unless you're allergic. The trick is to reduce the number of emissions in that room, in your environment, the environment you control. So, like for your cell phone, you have Bluetooth transmitters, you have Wi-Fi transmitters, and you have cell phone transmitters. All I use is Wi-Fi. I mean, cell phone. I don't need the other ones. So why do you have them on? You're transmitting a bee in the room. You have 3 bees in the room where you can only have one if you want. And so the trick is reduce the number of emissions in that room. As another example is, like right now I have a laptop that's a distance away from me. And that laptop is using Ethernet. It's not using the Wi-Fi. So again, I'm reducing the number of Wi-Fi transmissions into the room. And if your kids have it and your friends have it, and all of you do that, all of a sudden the emissions are pretty low. So that's one of the first kind of things you think about. How do I reduce the number of bees in the room I'm in?
That's perfect.
It's a simple thing to do. Rather than using wireless, use wire. Use Ethernet. Rather than having transmitters you don't use on, turn them off. The next thing is, if you use a cell phone and you are using it for less than 5 minutes or so, there is absolutely nothing you should be worried about. Those exposures don't really mean much. It's when you become a heavy user for long periods of time that it becomes a problem. If you're using it more than 3 hours a day for 10 years, you are 3 times more likely to get cancer of the brain, frontal lobe brain. It's pretty substantial. This is scientific evidence that shows that heavy users will have an increased probability of frontal lobe cancers. So limit your time, duration of use. And then, of course, the third one is very simple. And when you have a cell phone to your head, that's giving you the maximum penetration into the head. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. When you take it and you take it 1 foot away, 1 to 2 feet away, 80% of the potential danger to your frontal lobe is gone. By 4 foot, 98%. It's really that substantial. Simply moving devices away from you is really very helpful for maintaining a balance in your body. Now, I mentioned penetration a second ago, and I said I wanted to come back to it. And now let me tell you why. In the U.S., for example, we have standards 1.6 watts per kilogram that a cell phone can't exceed. That's the power coming from the cell phone itself, which, by the way, is a microwave signal. An RF signal is a microwave signal. In other words, when you take a piece of meat and put it in a microwave oven and cook it, it's the same signal, 2.3 gigahertz. A cell phone Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz. So it's a thermal emitting signal. It heats up stuff. And the standard at 1.6 watts is it can heat up in the U.S. by 2 degrees. Also, it can't penetrate more than 1 to 2 inches. That's where that standard came from over 30 years ago in the U.S. And when they defined that standard, they use 6-foot males. Their army of guys that were average 6 foot. And that's how they developed the standard, which is true worldwide, by the way, to some extent. And Sebastian, that represents about 3% of the population. If you have kids, if you have a wife, the cranial structure of each are very different, to the extent where if you have a 6-year-old child using a cell phone, the signal doesn't penetrate 1 to 2 inches; it goes completely through the head. So, right, and that's something you really don't want to do, and that's sort of an important point. When the standards were created worldwide, actually, they were worried more about the thermal impact and the biological impacts are really where the problem lies. And of course, we haven't talked about it, but things like neurological impacts, physiological, tingling, your eye may hurt. You may get headaches. You may get dizzy. You may lose some concentration and memory. There's a lot of associated symptoms associated with the RF exposure or the electromagnetic radiation exposure. And so these are very legitimate, and they can get more serious in time if you don't recognize that exposure.
Right. Yes. So we've sort of gone over. Sorry, I just lost my notes here. We've sort of touched on a lot of the points that I was curious about now already, which is amazing. You did address because what I was thinking of when I mentioned the distance is exactly what you said before, where if you just use a headset or the speaker or whatever on your phone and you put basically the EMF signal gets weaker the further it is away from you, essentially.
Yes.
So that's something that's really good to understand, I guess.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit more definition because your audience may be sort of thinking about variations. When you have a cell phone to your head, that's the worst condition you can have. That means that's likely the most exposure. When you have it in your hand and it's away from you and you're using speaker, that's the best way to use it. But by the other hand, everyone's going to hear what you're saying. So it's not necessarily the best way to do it. So there's been other ways that you can help that. And you're using, for example, earbuds that reduce the RF exposure, particularly to the brain to some extent. And they do a very good job of doing that. There's actually other products similar to that actually convert the electrical signal to acoustical link, and they eliminate all emissions from the head. And so there's another step beyond where you are. Probably you're okay, but if you're sensitive, it may not be enough. Now, one thing, the last thing about that space is, these earbuds that are wireless and you can connect to using Bluetooth to your cell phone or whatever you're using. They're using a Bluetooth signal that's about 3 watts. It's about 1/5 the strength of a standard RF signal for a cell phone. That doesn't sound like much, but actually, in some ways, it is, because it's so directly and close to the brain, the frontal lobe brain, which, by the way, is the soft tissue. The back of the brain is less susceptible. It's literally the front of the brain that's most significant. And we know from science, 0.1 watts, some scientific evidence that 0.1 watts can mutate a cell of the frontal lobe. So when you're using those devices all the time, you are potentially increasing your body's exposures to potential dangers. So I personally would not use those because of those very reasons. They're a higher risk when you do. They sound good, but they're also slightly
Yeah,
dangerous
yeah.
potentially.
So speaking of the science, again, I want to come back to that because as you know, there is some controversy around EMFs, and like a lot of very scientifically minded people will. I think I probably kind of reacted like that the first time I heard about them. You sort of just brush it off, or you think it's almost like woo woo or something like this. Uh,
Right, of
what?
course, yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
did. I mean, I never
yeah.
thought about it, right? And of course, I understood this stuff. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I understand that. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Like how strong is the science or the evidence that we have at this point, would you say? Like how much do we know? And we've already established that we don't know everything about this yet, but yeah, so what would you say to someone like that, you know?
There is a preponderance of scientific evidence, of well-structured scientific study on very specific parts of the body with outcomes that are statistically important. I was careful not to say significant, and I'm going to explain to you why. If you and I were going to try to figure out what the impact is on a human body from a toxin, it would probably take us a pretty long time to figure out if there is a direct correlation. Why? Because the data you get is 100 people here, 200 people there, 300 people the other way. They're not databases that are big enough to provide statistical sampling that's precise. If you and I were going to figure out what electromagnetic radiation does to 10-year-old children in school, we would have to lock 10,000 of them in a room and radiate them all, and then compare that to 10,000 kids who weren't radiated. We would
Yes.
never do that, right? We could never. But that is statistical sample that would be
And
accurate and precise within
Yep.
plus or minus 5%. So that is the problem with this, as it always is. You don't have large enough samples. So you look at the metadata, you look at all the individual studies, and you try to look at it together. And the evidence is truly strong. And then over the last 5 years or so, there's been statistically significant studies using epidemiology, which is the window to science, as
the
you may
window
know.
to science, a
And
good description. Yes.
yeah, it is what it's a great indicator of the actual problems. And in the U.S., there was the NTP, National Toxicity Program, that spent $35 million. They had a huge epidemiology population of rats and mice and male and female. And they found a statistically significant increase in frontal lobe cancer as well as heart. And that was not that surprising if you think about it, because it's the soft tissue that is the most vulnerable. And then right after that, there was another epidemiology out of Italy, at Ramazzani Institute, and they, believe it or not, had almost identical findings. They found that there was increased elevations both in heart and frontal lobe. So there's so much data by independent laboratories documenting conditions that are pretty significant in impacts to the human body. And that's the starting point of the conflict on one side. The other side sells services, and they don't want the industry necessarily to have a full understanding of what the implication is of the technologies they have. And this is an age-old conflict.
Yeah,
The
it's always
cigarette
been
smoking,
true. Yeah.
age-old conflict.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I'm not sure if this is actually true, but it seems like so many people are almost clueless to this in everyday life. I don't know. I guess I was like that before as well in many ways. So they are doing a very good job, these organizations, of communicating the right what they want people to know and hiding everything else.
Sebastian, when I was in Bell Labs, I don't know if I mentioned that exactly. I was in Bell Labs in the research and development area, and I had a guy next to me who was the world expert in electromagnetic radiation and interference. The world expert. He would not use a phone. He just from the experience he had, he said, "I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to expose myself." And it is true. We just don't know. And it is really hard to have clad tight understanding that there's truly a danger. And because of that confusion, and because the factions on both sides one has $1 billion, on the other side they have $1 trillion a year. It's hard to win the war because of the difference in horsepower.
Like you said, age-old problem.
It's age-old. Yeah, I often give another example of trans fats. In Europe, trans fats were abolished years ago. It only happened 2 years ago in the U.S. But there's a biochemist, and he said 30 years ago, he said, it's not the eggs that are killing us, it's the trans fats we're cooking our French fries in. And it took over 30 years for that to be recognized in the community and then banned. I'm not saying telephone use is going to be banned ever, but I am saying that you learn more in time, and it takes a long time to get there.
So it's sort of, especially for those of us who grew up with a lot of these technologies, it seems a little bleak, I think, when you think about how many times you've done this to yourself and all this stuff. Like how many times I've sat with my laptop in my lap and everything. What do you think? Like, should everyone just like? Is it already too late for a lot of people? Do you think, or like, should everyone just move out to the woods and like hide? What needs to happen? Do you think?
I often point out we're all not going to take a flight to the moon to get away from this. It's just not what we're going to do. And it's also true that if you are prudent in understanding the environment you live, you're pretty safe. And it's simple things you can do around your environment that really make a big difference. Because when you get excessively exposed, your body's reacting to it. And then when you get away from that exposure, your body recovers. And so, like, there are things we can do. We can be diligent about what we do with our technologies around us, and we can balance it. And you're safe. I often point out, you do not have to take excessive steps to make sure you're safe. If you use simple rules around the use of the devices around us.
So that's a very good way to sort of remind everyone. Let's sum it up a little bit. What are those main strategies? Would you think? Like, what are the main offenders, and what are the main strategies? Maybe the top 3 or whatever.
Okay, so anything close to your body is not so good. So time and distance are your friends. Others use an additional shielding to prevent signals from your device transfers to the human. But it's time and distance. When you use technology, be prudent about the time in which you're using it. And rather than hours, do it minutes. That simple rule is 60% of the problem. The other, of course, is distance. Turn it off, or if you have it near you, put it at least 4 foot away from you. Except in sleep. We haven't talked about, one of the things electromagnetic radiation does interfere with biological functions. We know that it's not just the eye you're worried about. It's not just the blue light you're worried about. The RF signal itself disrupts the brainwave patterns of the frontal lobe. And so when you have a cell phone on your nightstand right next to your head when you're sleeping, and you have a tablet that you just used all night just before you went to bed, you are setting yourself up that the sanctuary you should be in is not there. And so the trick is build a sanctuary. Remove all those devices in your room. Be cautious about the technology you use before you go to bed. 2 hours before you decide to go to sleep, don't use electronics around you and reading, and you're fine. But the sanctuary is sort of important. Sebastian, as you know, there's a 24-hour cyclic nature of the human body, and the circadian rhythm is disrupted by some of these technologies. And in some cases, with some clinics we work with, it can get pretty severe. You're walking around with a brain pattern that's a sleep pattern, and you're sleeping with a wake pattern, the beta versus the alpha. So you really want to make sure that you minimize those exposures, particularly at the important points of your cycle and rest, so you recover from the day and as strong as the following day.
Like intuitively, I think this is probably the most impactful thing you can do. And the way I'm thinking about it is that we are very resilient, as like our organism is very resilient. As long as we get some sort of break from things, we can recover, and the body's very good at repairing damage and stuff like this. But like, if we have these things, and again, a lot of it we don't know yet, as you said, but like, say it is very bad for our tissues, and especially soft tissues and all this stuff. If we then have it 24 hours a day, the body never gets time to recover. It's just so and I know, like, I can even sense it in myself, like how stupidly how much friction there is in a lot of people. I'm guessing in just like shutting off the Wi-Fi, putting the phone outside of the bedroom, and hopefully shutting it off as well. All this stuff. It's not that hard, is it? Like we kind of make a big deal of it. Yeah.
It's Sebastian. You say you turn off the Wi-Fi. Get a timer. Have it turn off at 11 o'clock at night, and at 7 o'clock in the morning when you wake up, turn it on. You're going to be there. It doesn't cost you anything. It's a very conservative way of dealing with the potential concerns we have about this kind of stuff, and it's easy to implement. And you don't have to remember it. Someone like me, I don't have to remember it, which is good.
That would be good for me as well. I'm gonna actually. I saw one of the practitioners we work with also posted about that tip recently. So I'm gonna actually do that. I also have there's another device that's like super cheap and simple, where you can just click, like there's like an adapter into the wall where that's remote controlled. Maybe that's even more EMF, I don't know. But you can actually just click instead of pulling the plug on things and stuff like this. You can just shut it on and off with a click on a remote control. Maybe that's helpful. I don't know.
So I don't know about the device, but it will work. When you have current flow in your walls, it's the current flow, the energy being used, that's creating the emissions from the wall. By preventing a device from drawing power, drawing current, eliminates the exposure. And by the way, when you create your sanctuary in your bedroom, you don't put your headboard next to a plug that's hot, right? Because it's low emissions, but we know for sure for some, it does interfere with their sleep.
Right. This has been fantastic for me, to be honest. It's super interesting, and to get just more of an accurate picture of all of this. I want to end on the question that I ask all the guests that come on here, and that is, what lifestyle change or lifestyle factor has been most impactful for your personal health and well-being?
The importance of balance. You talked about resilience, and I thought of resilience as an isolated way, but that's not true. You have to eat right, you have to sleep right, you have to have the rules of the road in the environment we live, and it's the combination of all those things that you manage to have a healthy, resilient lifestyle. And I did not think of that years ago, but over the last 15 years or so, I've realized the importance of that balance in all of those parts of your life.
Very true. You can be you can be perfect in one area, but if you don't balance it with all the other things that the body needs, then it doesn't really count for much.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct.
Perfect. This has been great. Where can people go to find more about you, find out more about you and your work and everything, online or elsewhere?
We have a website, defendershield.com. And at defendershield.com, we have a learning section that actually provides the scientific evidence. It logs the scientific evidence. So if you're looking for information, you can see where some of this is coming from the science community. We have products as well we sell that are shielding products for the human body. We have the book Radiation Nation available on our website. We keep it pretty inexpensive because our goal is to help people understand the environment we live in. So Radiation Nation is, to me, an important part of helping others understand what it really is and not speculate excessively about the dangers when it's not really there, but be realistic about ones that are concerning. So defendershield.com is where to go. And we also have on defendershield.com something I recently started with supplements. I was worried that the body resilience was being interfered with by other parts of life as well as by those parts that are affecting, that we could help booster the body, particularly in the digital world, the digital environment we all find ourselves in. And there are certain parts of the human body that do react differently in this digital world that supplements can actually support to some extent. So we have a product line now that we've just added recently, which is to boost the body's resilience.
Perfect. And I actually just realized that I forgot to mention this, but there will be a discount code for anyone who's interested in any of this, what you said. Yeah. I think we said 10 or 15%. I'm going to have to check, but it will be in the description and you can access it if you want to. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much for this, Dan. It's been really great. And yeah, I hope to speak to you soon, and I'll actually probably order myself one of those Faraday bags and stuff for my phone and all this stuff. So,
well, I'm also unsolicitedly going to send you a set of earbuds.
Well, that's much appreciated.
Because it's low. What you're using is low, but why not eliminate it if you can?
I'm not against that. Absolutely.
Right, exactly. So I'll have
Oh,
Hannah send you a
that's
set of
very
earbuds as
very very
well.
kind. Great. All right. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Sebastian, thanks so much for inviting me. I did enjoy this chat.
Fantastic.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Chronic Health Podcast. Please take a second to rate our show or review it wherever you listen to it. And if you know someone who might benefit from listening, then please consider sharing it with them as well. All right. Thanks again. And until next time.